Alright everyone, so it's time for the second portion of our day one review notes. So first up, I'm actually going to clear out some of the stuff in here just so we can have a couple of simpler things to work on. Oh, nope, just kidding. There we go. Oh, okay. So what we're looking for is I've got a straight line, oops, and a curved line. So what we need to talk about now, we looked at them briefly, but the anchor points and the vector line that go into building these shapes, and then we also need to look at some examples from the book in terms of building actual stuff and not just scribbles. So first up, looking at what makes up these tools or these drawings. So our second tool down is called the subselection tool, and I've used it a couple times to kind of show you these anchor points and these vector lines. But what's technically happening is the anchor points are anchors basically, and there's math determining how the line goes in between them. But you can see that some of these lines are straight and some of them are curved. So we need to look at how to alter them in kind of what they mean very directly. So if I use this top tool, a regular selection tool, if I have something already selected, meaning I click and I let go and then I drag it, it moves. But if I don't, if I hold it down like this, if I don't have it selected, I can bend it. And now if we look at these anchor points, we can see that the line is being told to curve now. If the line is already curved, it'll do that, but it will, you see how you can kind of tell it's not curving uniformly? That's how you can tell that there are anchor points there. If I undo and I look at it, you can tell it's kind of chafing against these anchor points. So that trick of something not being selected already and bending it just intuitively with the top tool, it works, but only kind of. So if you really want to manipulate the shape of something, you want to grab the anchor point tool, the subselection tool. Because when you do that, then you can click on an actual anchor point and drag it around. And you can see when you do that, at least in the case of the curved section here, we get these handles. They're called Bezier handles or Bezier handles. And these are what tell the line how to go from anchor point to anchor point. So here, there's no handles at all because they're straight. So if you have a linear, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's called a linear curve, then there's no handles. And then this one, there's handles. So the way these handles work is, first of all, if you want to add them to something, you hold down Alt and drag off the anchor point, and you can add them. And it'll create them. So I'm doing this here. There we go. And I'm trying to make them as much as possible, as far as the human eyeball is concerned, the same length and the same angle. So I want these two lines parallel because you can see that that kind of makes the curve pretty even. Each little wave is kind of the same height, it's just one's in the reverse direction of the other, and that otherwise this is pretty reversible. Because I want to show what happens when that's not the case. So the angle of this line determines how the line curves, like what direction the line curves in. So if I pull it this way, you can see the line curves that way. If I pull it this way, see it curves that way. But the length of the line is what determines which of these handles is exerting more influence, or rather, it determines how much influence is being exerted. So if I keep this at the same angle, but push this one over here, and I keep this one at the same angle, but I draw it out. So they're still parallel lines, but one of them is much, much larger than the other. And you can see what that does to the curve. So this is only a little bit of influence, and this is a whole lot of influence. So you can see how if you pull this too much here, you can sort of get a bit of a kink in the line because these things are overlapping. Now that's not to say that's the wrong way to do it, but you kind of have to be careful. Sometimes things like this can happen. You can kind of reverse things. This is how these lines think. If I look at the curved line, these are all much smaller handles, and you can see when you click on one, you can see that handles for that, and then the handles for the other parts of the line, but not for here. You can see when I spin these around, This was drawn as a circle earlier. These handles are connected. That's called an unbroken tangent. So, strength-wise, they're not connected, but in terms of the way they're influencing the line, they are. If you want to break it, you hold down Alt. So just like holding down Alt created one in the first place, holding down Alt will break the tangent and allow you to make this into, you know, like a daisy or something. There we go. Once it's broken, it's broken. So once I break it once, I'm holding down Alt. I don't have to hold down Alt again. They're going to function, oh, crying out loud. They're going to function separately. There we go. You can tell that they're a little bit hard to work with. They're not easy to select, and we can't make them look any bigger. No matter how much you zoom into your screen, they are that size, unless you actually use like a window zoom. And I can tell just by looking at this that the angle on this one isn't quite right. Like they should be pulled out a little bit because there's this like point here, and that this one it's pulled out too much because this is kind of curving wrong. So the more you work with these, oh for God's sake, the more you work with these, the more you're going to get a handle on how they work. There we go. And there we go. If I pull this out a little bit of a rounder edge, I can do the same thing here. And this is how vectors think. It's very, very finicky, and it's very it's like you need an interpreter almost, right? So computers don't speak the same language that we do, so we have to kind of convince them of what we want in an indirect way, as opposed to a paintbrush, which is just a matter of drawing directly on the canvas, right? So the paintbrush and the pencil, we're just drawing directly. When you're working with shapes, it's all very indirect, and you have to kind of convince it of what you want. But that is how these shapes break down. That's how they think. So I'm going to close that and open up. All the chapters in our book are by the files are named after the chapters. So you want to look for the chapter that's, if you want to find this file, it's geometric and organic shapes. And hang on, I'll show you that in a minute. So if you are on a slightly older version of the software at home, you will get a message that says this was created in a later version. There's a lot of flexibility in Animate and the old Flash CC, Flash CC, and maybe even CS6, where you can open newer files in older versions. Now, if you have very, very fancy tools at work, they will no longer function, but just general drawing, you can kind of go back and forth. There's more flexibility than in, say, Illustrator. But I like this because it shows how you can think with shapes and abstract and kind of reuse things. So if you look at the end result, it's a tree with branches and those little spots and all this stuff. But if you look at how it's built, it's actually all primitives. See, we can barely see the outline. So we're going to right click Properties, and I'm going to change the outline color to something more helpful given the color scheme we're working in. There we go. That's what we're looking for. So we can see how it's built. So I got a couple shapes. Now eventually they do something to combine the shapes. If you're working with the sort of regular drawings that we usually have, that's actually very easy. It's impossible to avoid. You can see that when we click on this whole tree, it's in a container of some sort. We're going to next time go over some of these containers. Because it's not just that there's drawing tools in here, there's also ways to contain different ideas into different shapes and different forms and different uses. So there's a lot of different things that work here. Let me see. So the tree branches also, it starts off as a primitive, a rectangle, and then kind of bend it a little, make a new one to make very pointy here, and you can see that this is the same as this one. This one's a little different, but it gets reused, I think, over here, for here. So you can copy and paste very easily. You just select it and Control-C, Control-V, or right-click, copy, right-click, either paste in center or paste in place, which puts them right on top of each other, and then you can kind of slide them over. You can also edit, copy, edit, paste. So we got a lot of options for copy and paste. And this is one of the reasons you work in vectors, is because it's very, very easy to make duplicates of things. And then last but not least, we have the birdhouse that starts as 2 primitives, combine them there, and then you kind of manually skew them into the perspective shape that you want. Be aware, you can see this very, very small sort of side. If the tree is going to be this much in the background, that's not necessary. But if it's going to be featured pretty prominently, then it's a nice touch. So how much detail you put in depends on where it's going to end up. I also like this little slice right here to kind of ground the tree. And one last thing I want to show you in this file is you can see all this extra maroon color. Here, it's just the outline is here. And then here, you can see every little spot has that information. Now, this file is not that big, but if you have this across however many frames of animation moving, then you can start to get into larger file sizes that are also very slow, because you have each shape, that information, that's the information. The same color being reused, that's not too bad, but this is one of the things to kind of look out for. So if you're doing something that's hand drawn with like the brush tool or the pencil tool and your hand drawing animation, that can get very heavy as well. These files are actually very, very small. If we look into week 1, we can see, yeah, so barely a few kilobytes. This one's 2 megs, and it has 2 characters in it. So these are very, very small file sizes for the most part, but if you were to animate this, that could actually start to grow a little bit. So before I move on to the next file, I want to show you something. For class, I will always provide the files we're using in class. However, if you want the other files, you can go to crcpress.com and search for Adobe Animate, and that should bring up within the top part of the search results our book. If you go to the link in the book, you have to type in all this nonsense, which is dumb. But under downloads and updates, e-resources, that's what you're looking for, and that will be all of the files that go with the book, because we can't get to the whole book in this one class. That's insane. But you will be able to get the files that we aren't working with in class and be able to kind of take a look at things. Don't save. So the other files I showed in class that you can get from the week 1 folder on the K drive are a couple other characters. So we can kind of see different ways that people go about things. One of them, this little girl, is all drawn in a brush. And you can see also all of these pieces are in these containers. They're a little bit different than the ones you saw earlier. But actually I'm going to make a new layer. And we're going to drag it to the bottom because I want to put something behind her so we can see. There you go. So you can see why they would be in containers like this. It's not just the loop-de-loop. It's actually, there's some color and white color in there so that you can put backgrounds in and you won't see through her hair, because that would be very, very difficult to work with. And of course, you could always change this to whatever color you want, and you could give her a whole lot of green hair or something like that. So you can make characters that kind of look like they're hand drawn, but still act as these sort of puppets that can be moved around in here like a flash cutout animation. The other one, we don't go over the pen tool too much, but if you're familiar with it from other vector programs, you can use it here. She was drawn with the pen tool, and you can kind of tell because of the way the line weight can be different sometimes, and how it's very specific. You can also see that she was drawn with pencil first, so there's nothing wrong with sketching something out in pencil and then bringing it into here. And then I think she's all on one layer. So, and then this is on its own layer. So just keep in mind that you also have a pen tool if you would like, and we'll get to them later, but you can also see that there's a gradient in a couple places. But also that some of these, there we go. Yeah, so some of this color is done with just layers on top of each other. So layers of circles on top of each other rather than over here, which we have a gradient. And next time we're going to talk about kind of adding these kinds of details. Close. And then next up, something we're going to talk about much more next time. That's the I don't have this particular typeface, which is why it's yelling at me. Um, I show this because vector programs by default look like this, look like the guy on the left. So the guy on the left has no shading except for a couple of highlights, which also take a lot of work to put in because everything's very flat. And there's no option in here, as there is in Photoshop, to like scribble in with the burn tool and add some shading. To add shading is very, very, very deliberate and sort of must be chosen carefully because you have to pick a very specific color to shade with, and you have to, there's a lot of work to do to put that in there, and we're going to learn some tricks for that next time. But understand that there is a look to this that basically was how it functions. I will say also that if you're looking for ideas on how to think about this kind of shading, this guy right here actually looks a lot like a lot of American cartoons, but anime, Japanese animation, their TV animation, they've been putting these kinds of shadows in their characters forever, even on cell drawings. And it, even with cell drawings, it required the same, you know, you can't have graduated shading, you have to have just a color and another color. So something to keep in mind, you can look at some stills from that and see how they think about blocking out color and how they think about choosing color. I'm going to double click on this so we can see this. When you're choosing a shadow color, you can go on the swatch and then click this top right hand corner. And there's a couple different ways to think about this. So by default, a lot of times the color picker you get is this because it's going by RGB, which I find useless. I can't think like that. And I said in class that you can click on the H and get the standard Photoshop color, which is the hue is along the side. There's a slider, and then saturation is left to right. Yes, saturation is left to right, and then lightness is up and down, or brightness, as we might call it, because we're on a projected system. But if you click on the B, what happens is we get still saturation is over here, but it's actually top to bottom. Hue is from left to right, so it goes, you know, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, etc. And then the lightness is what's over here. And so you can stay within the same hue and the same saturation, but get a technically darker color, which I overshot it, but that's kind of what they did here. Technically speaking, if you wanted to have something that stayed the same hue and the same lightness, and you just wanted to shift the saturation down, that's also something you could do here. So whichever one of these you choose depends on how you think about color. In class, you'll probably see me use this one just because I'm used to it, but just something to think of when you're choosing what color to work with. And you can see I keep double clicking on things. Coming back out to scene one. Be aware that these containers that I keep mentioning do exist, and if you're not careful, you end up in them, and then you start working in them and you don't realize it. So if you are ever, let me go to something I know is going to work. By the way, Control W for closing and Control O for opening. There we go. So if I double click on her hair right here, see how the rest of her grays out? So that's one way to know that you're inside a container and that you shouldn't be working in there. Most of the rest of it looks the same except for this right underneath the title of the file you're in. But not everything does that depending on the container you're going into. If I double click on the tree, see how none of this is grayed out, which is unfortunate. Can I move this? Yeah, okay. So, but I can't move these things. These are all, I can't change these. So it's less obvious sometimes what's going on. And I can go, yeah, as deep as I want, and I can't see that I'm in there, other than you can see I'm a few layers deep. And you go back out to scene one, and now you can affect change on these other things. So one of the things we're going to have to go over the next few weeks is how to understand what containers you're in or not, and making sure, at least for now, that you're working out here in the main timeline. There are fixes in case you're inside something, but it's better to make sure you're working in the right place at the right time. All right, so that is all for part 2 of our basics, and next time we'll be working with more advanced drawing tools and learning about these various containers.